Greetings and welcome to the fourth and final gathering of the London Book Club series with Professor Ian Newman in London in Song. As many of you know, I see many familiar faces out there. I'm Father Jim Leese of the Congregation of Holy Cross, and I serve as the academic lead on the Notre Dame London program. And we're delighted to welcome you to this fourth of a four-part series. As we begin, I want to thank again the partners of this series, the College of Arts and Letters, the Office of Notre Dame International, the de Bartolo Center for the Performing Arts, the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, the Keough-Naughton Institute, the Office of Notre Dame Learning, and especially the Notre Dame Alumni Association. Thanks to all of our co-sponsors who have contributed so much time and talent to bring this program to life and their assistance. We're delighted to have such a large group registered today. There's always far more registered than are able to be on screen, and we tape it for that reason. We ask you to use the Google form that we're sending in a link to the chat box to submit any questions that might come up during the course of our time together. We'll try to answer as many of them as possible before we run out of time. In the event that we don't get to all of them, we have had an ongoing LinkedIn page where we could address them between sessions. If there's any lingering questions at the end of our series, I'll leave it to Ian to decide if he wants to take those up. I could take them up, but I'd just be making up answers. I think Ian would be the better one. In any case, I want to introduce Ian now, a colleague and friend. Many of you were here with us over the past 3 weeks, but for the newcomers, Ian is on the faculty of the English department at Notre Dame. He has been a visiting scholar at King's College London for a project called Music in London, 1800 to 1851. He has also lived in London for about 5 years and has written extensively about London in various articles and books and digital projects, including the book, The Romantic Tavern, which uncovered the history of London taverns in the late 18th century. You can imagine how delighted we are and have been to have him guide us through this series called London in Song. I'm particularly excited about this song because about 30 years ago, before I entered the seminary, I worked in London and my office was just off of Berkeley Square. So I've always found this song somewhat appealing ever since that time. As you may know, when we promoted this event, we shared a few pre-recorded videos and readings that were posted on ThinkND, where Ian provided some good overview of our topic. They will inform our final conversation today. Ian, warmest of welcomes to you again.
Hi, thank you, Father Jim, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us one more time for a discussion of a Nightingale sang in Berkeley Square. Now, before I go any further, I need to apologize for the fact that my brain keeps doing these mental flips. When I lived in London, I knew it was pronounced Berkeley Square, and I knew that. And then I moved to California, and then every time I had to say the word Berkeley, I had to adjust for the word Berkeley. And now I can never remember which is the right one and which one I'm supposed to be adjusting to. So I'll try and keep calling it Berkeley Square for your benefit today. But if I get it wrong, please forgive me. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us one more time for the series that explores the history of London by examining the popular music that it has inspired. Last week, we spoke to Jason Whitaker about the song Jerusalem, a very sort of patriotic national song, although we were digging in a little bit and discovering about both its conservative and its radical adaptations. This week, we're doing something quite different. This is a song that is, I never quite know what the best genre to describe it as. I've called it lounge in one of the things online, but I don't know if that quite gets it. It's sort of easy listening-ish, smooth jazz. No, it's not even smooth jazz. But it's sort of, it has its origins in sort of light popular entertainment, but it's been recorded by all kinds of recording artists, and it's really interesting. Partly, I want to say, for the amount of people that have found it an appealing song to record, but I also think that there's something extremely interesting when you come at it from the long history of mainstream music that we've been tracing, to discover how similar each of the versions of this are. And so that's something that I want to think about a little bit today. In particular, compared with something like Sam Hall or Jack Hall, where the versions are just wildly different. The same thing for the Jolly Waterman, the official version versus the folk version are very, very different songs. But A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square, pretty much every recording has the same set of words. The arrangements are slightly different in each case, but broadly speaking, it's very identifiable as the same song in each case. So that tells us something quite interesting, I think, about what happens to mainstream music in the 20th century and beyond. And that's what I really want to think about today. So the lesson plan for today, if you'll pardon the expression, is that I will recap, as I've done in the past, some of the things that are online for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it. We don't have a guest speaker this week, so we'll revert to week 1 protocols, and we'll have breakout groups in the middle of the section so that you can discuss some things amongst yourselves. And what I really want to encourage you to do is share with us what you were discussing in the breakout rooms, so that we can open it out into a general conversation towards the end of the session. However, I think the first thing that I should do is play you a version of the song so that we can all hear it. And I want to start off not with the Vera Lynn version, which was the one that I asked you to listen to in advance of this session, but instead the Nat King Cole version. And I think if you listen to the Vera Lynn version, you will notice that it has quite a lot in common. So bear with me 1 second while I share my screen with you and play the song in the Nat King Cole version.
See video description for links to songs.
Okay, in case you were wondering, that's how I sound when I'm singing in the shower. I have a voice just like that. I love that recording of it, and the thing that I want to draw your attention to is all of the ways that the orchestra is trying to echo the sound of the Nightingale throughout it. There was kind of that just at the very end, that little riff of the jump, 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 that happens throughout. It's one of the things that distinguishes certain recordings over the others, is how much they're trying to echo the sound of the Nightingale itself throughout the song. But let me now just recap some of the things that were put online, some of the materials that I shared with you earlier, particularly for those who haven't had the chance to look over them yet. There's a couple of things that I really want to emphasize about this song and its place in our series of programs in London and Song. And I think what we are now in a position to be able to tell that we may not have been able to tell before this series is what is happening to mainstream music by the time you reach the 20th century. And that's the thing that I want to talk about today. The first thing is that it becomes much more respectable, and particularly in the 19th century, mainstream music, the kinds of music that we've been looking at that have been circulating around in ballads, in broadside ballads, in street culture and oral culture, particularly in the 19th century, that gets marked as the kind of art of the poor, right? We've talked about this a little bit in previous episodes. What happens in the 20th century is a respectabilization of mainstream and popular song. That is a word that I've just made up. But popular song becomes increasingly more respectable. And one of the really interesting things I think about The Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square is it really directly points home this idea that we're no longer talking about the kind of, the gallows, the dirty gin palaces, the places where criminals get dragged along the streets. This is not the sort of the mainstream music of the urban poor and the criminal classes. This is something that is extremely bourgeois, that is enjoying its sense of its own eliteness, right? And that's part of what's happening in the song, which is itself participating in these larger trends that's happening to mainstream music. It begins in the late 19th century and goes throughout the 20th century. But I think you need that long history of mainstream music to be able to see the intensity with which that is happening in a song like this. Okay, so to recap some of the materials on the website, the first video that I shared with you outlined a bit of a history of Berkeley Square itself. And it's quite important that it was part of the Berkeley estate that then became Devonshire House and the Devonshire estate in the 18th century. The main thing about this is that all of the lands from Piccadilly right the way up to where Berkeley Square is now, it was all fields for a really, really long time. And it only got developed, that area that used to be where Devonshire House was, it only got developed after Devonshire House was destroyed, which was after the First World War. So at the beginning of the 20th century. And in fact, it was only beginning to get developed at the point where Michael Arlen writes his story, When a Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square. So that was a new development when Arlen is writing. So Berkeley Square, some of the buildings on the square were slightly older than that. The square had been preserved for a number of centuries. But it's part of this new development that occurs to the north of Piccadilly that has a lot of sort of commercial properties in it. And so that thing, this kind of urbanization of this area of London is happening right at the moment when the story on which the song is based was written. Okay, the other thing that I want to say about Berkeley Square is, particularly if you go visit it now, and Father Jim will be able to tell you this because he lived there, it's in a very exclusive area. And besides Berkeley Square itself, which is a very lovely sort of park in the middle of central London, all of the stuff around it includes all the fashion industry, if you walk down the road, there's all kinds of like really interesting knick-knacky kind of shops that have been there for centuries, like really old sort of shaving shops and places that sell like fancy chocolate and extremely expensive whiskey and things like that. There's all of these sort of boutique shops in that area. It's a very prestigious part of London. And in the videos, I was trying to liken it to the version of London that you get when you see London in the movies, right? If you watch something like The Crown, say, these are the shots that you get, or dare I say it again, Bridgerton. These are the shots of London that you're likely to get, these sort of very nice, exclusive, fancy areas of London. And the thing that I want to point out about that is that it is a really short distance away from some of the other areas where people were getting hung, where they were stopping for their last drink on their way to the gallows that we've explored earlier on in this series. So it's this little pocket of real high prestige that is abutting all these areas that have been traditionally associated with the urban poor. It's a really luxurious place, a place of fancifulness. Okay, and the third thing I want to say is that this sort of more elite space in the middle of London can tell you something about what is happening to the mainstream music of the day, right? It is getting absorbed into the middle class. It's getting absorbed into bourgeois culture, and so mainstream popular song is trying to make itself seem respectable. Not necessarily consciously in the song itself, but as part of the general historical trend of where popular mainstream music is going. Okay, so that was the first video. The online essay that I shared with you for this week was on nightingales, which is one of the most overdetermined images in the history of literature. I mean, they go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. They're there in Homer and Ovid. They're throughout Milton and Shakespeare. I shared with you a clip of the amazing scene known as the Aubade scene in a sort of breakfast scene in Romeo and Juliet, where Romeo and Juliet are arguing about whether they've just heard a nightingale or whether they've heard the dove after they've woken up, after they've sort of consummated their marriage, before the tragic events of Romeo and Juliet unfolded. It's a really storied image, this image of the nightingale, and it means many different things, but they're always kind of circling around a few ideas. Firstly, it's springtime, so new hope, new joy. The nightingale comes, starts singing, and that's the sign of spring, right? So new birth, new growth. Also, the thing about the nightingale, and the clue is in the name, is that it sings at night. So it's the bird of the dusk rather than the morning. And that's the thing that Romeo and Juliet talk about. Is it the nightingale? And I just said dove a minute ago. I meant the lark. Is it the nightingale or is it the lark? The lark is the signal of morning. Nightingale is the signal of evening. Okay, so it means spring, it means nighttime, and the other association with it throughout the history of literature is with mourning. The Nightingale is the song that has a mournful song, and that goes back to a bunch of the ancient stories, particularly in Ovid, where Philomela, which is another name for the nightingale, gets raped, and then there's a mourning song that she performs as part of her grief. So those are the three primary associations with the nightingale: spring, nighttime, and morning, with a U as opposed to without. The point about this, though, is that by the time you get to the Romantic period, so this is the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, all of the poets are talking about how hackneyed and cliched an image to talk about a nightingale is. So Coleridge in particular is really, really good on this. It's like, why do poets keep talking about nightingales all the time? It's a really old, boring image that they don't want to use anymore. So they're trying to divorce themselves from the image. They recognize it as part of the poetic tradition, but they want to try and do something new. Keats famously in the Ode to a Nightingale is talking about the way that he wants to get over older models of poetic expression and move on to something new and exciting. And that is the thing that the nightingale is offering as a symbol for him. It's a symbol of the past, but that can offer renewal. So the point here is that by the time you get to the 20th century, and by the time Michael Arlen writes his short story, and then it gets adapted into a song, it's already for a century been an old, cliched, hackneyed image that you can't use unless it's dripping with irony, right? You can only use it if you're being deeply sarcastic about it. And that is what happens in the Michael Arlen story. The idea of the nightingale singing in Berkeley Square is, of course, the fact that a nightingale is never going to sing in Berkeley Square, because Berkeley Square, for all of its eliteness, for all of its sort of fancy bourgeois nature, it's urban. And you're not going to get a nightingale singing in Berkeley Square. And I think this is the really interesting thing about the Michael Arlen story. Hopefully a few of you have had a chance to read it. It's a really interesting story. And Michael Arlen was and I'm moving here to talk about the third video that I posted, was an extremely well-known humorist in the 1920s. He wrote satirical essays and short stories and a couple of novels, but he was really well-known as a sort of man about town. He was a dandyish figure that wore elaborate hats and drove a Rolls Royce around central London. He was known as the F. Scott Fitzgerald of England. And when he is talking about Berkeley Square, which is, remember, brand new at the point where he is writing, it is a site of boredom and ennui. All the characters in his stories are extremely bored with the tedium and the relentlessness of their very well appointed but impoverished, at least spiritually, lives, right? So the story, When a Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square, is a story of a love triangle that is going disastrously wrong. It's set in a single room in a house. It's luxuriously appointed. There's candlesticks everywhere. People lean against fireplaces and look very, very glamorous. But the point is, they're completely soulless bored individuals. The story of the love triangle, the crux of that story is really all about the fact that everybody is bored with one another. And so there's a marriage in the middle, and both people in the marriage are trying to get rid of the other in one way or another, and try to pass them off onto somebody else in the politest way that they can, right? So that Berkeley Square is both urban, and so you're not going to get a Nightingale in it, but it's also a site of absolute boredom. So this symbol of the Nightingale that sings in Berkeley Square, which bookends the story, it's the first paragraph and the last paragraph. And the point that Michael Arlen makes is, a nightingale, I've been told, sang at Berkeley Square when all of this stuff was happening, but I don't actually know if it means anything. Right? It's a symbol that has been so wrung out of all kind of meaning that it's now totally meaningless. And that's the level at which the irony of the Nightingale singing in Berkeley Square is operating in the short story version. Okay. So it's a symbol that is so potent, that is so storied, that has such a long tradition in literature, that it has become meaningless. Right, there's too much meaning, so it becomes so there's no meaning attached to it anymore. Okay, and then Eric Maschwitz finds the title of the story when he's in a little bar in the south of France in the summer of 1939, and he writes the song "A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square." Now he claims and sort of implies that he never actually read the rest of the story. He just saw the title and thought it was a really nice title, and then never read the rest of the story. I believe it because it's not really a dramatic retelling of the events of the story in any way in song. So it's completely convincing that he never read the rest of the story. But it is interesting that deeply ironic image of the Nightingale swimming in Berkeley Square appealed to the songwriter, right? I think what happens to the song at that point is really interesting, that it gets reconverted into a romantic song. In the version that we just heard by Nat King Cole, it is noticeably at a slow tempo. It's again something that seems to suggest that romance is so powerful that it can turn the world on its head, and so that even a nightingale can sing in Berkeley Square. Okay, the thing that I want to just reiterate about that before I hand over and we'll move into our breakout sessions is that this is the music that was extremely popular in the interwar period and during the Second World War. So Maschwitz and Eric Sherwin, the Sherwin wrote the music, Maschwitz wrote the words. They were extremely popular songwriters that had hit after hit in the West End. So they're writers for theatre. Okay. And that was the soundtrack to the Blitz, if you like, in London, right? So this was a song, and particularly the Vera Lynn version is explicitly that. This is the music that was playing when German bombers were flying over London and destroying London. And so it becomes a really powerful sort of nostalgic and almost patriotic song for a version of London that is under threat. Okay. So we're going to move to breakout rooms now. And I want you, when you move to breakout rooms, to think of 3 questions, and we'll put them on screen in a minute so that you have them in front of you. The questions that I want you to think about are, which version of the song do you like best? And here I'm sort of hoping that you're already familiar with the song and you've heard a few versions in the past. If not, that's fine. But if so, I want to know what was the version that you know best, and why, under what circumstances did you hear it? So, and what do you like about it? Secondly, as I said at the beginning, this is a song that is much more stable. There's fewer variants of it. The words are more or less exactly the same in every version. There's a few differences in the arrangement, but basically it's a very stable song, and especially compared with, say, Jack Hall or the Jolly Young Waterman. So I want you to think a little bit about why that might be. Why do you think this has fewer variants? What are the mechanisms by which song starts to stabilize in the 20th century? And the third thing is, what, if anything, do you think this song tells us about Berkeley Square and what it represents? So those are the three questions. We'll go to breakout room for the next few minutes. I want to, when you're in your groups, can you introduce yourselves to each other, share your location if you're comfortable with it, and your occupation and your affiliation with the university if you have one. And then once you've introduced yourself, discuss the three questions that will come up on the board again in just a second, or now. And then if you could appoint a lead for your room, your breakout room, who can help communicate between your breakout room and what you discuss in it and us, so that we can have a good discussion of the things that you've been talking about after the break. We expect that you'll follow the rules of civil discourse, of course, and that you'll respect each other's comments. So please note that anytime during the breakout session, you'll be able to return back to this main room. And when we return, please have the room leads use the chat function to share with us any key questions or any takeaways from your discussion for me and Father Jim to discuss after the session. Okay, breakout rooms, off you go. Okay, hi everyone. I think everyone is returning to us from their breakout rooms. I hope that was productive. We're going to spend another minute now. I'm going to play you another version of the song, just to give the people who were designated the room lead an opportunity to type up a couple of things to share with us. What I'd ask you to do is any insights or answers to the questions that I posed are certainly welcome, but any questions that you might have for me would be welcome too. And they don't have to be in the form of questions, just anything that came up out of your discussion that you'd like to share with the rest of the group, that would be fantastic. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to write up a couple of things to the chat, which has just been shared with everyone, and I'll play you the Rosemary Clooney recording of this Nightingale sang in Berkeley Square. Bear with me one more time as I share my screen.
See video description for links to songs.
I hope you appreciated that elegant fade. Okay, I'll be happy to answer any questions for you.
There was a reference earlier in the chat that one of our participants loved the old rockers, Rod Stewart and Ian Hunt. I'm not seeing it right now, but Ian Hunter recorded version. But there's another question in that regard. Are there any punk versions? Several of the group talked about knowing London in the 80s, and they certainly missed a version that was different from the romantic ones, and are wondering if there are any out there like that.
I can't tell you 100% for sure. I don't know of any. And I think that is itself kind of interesting, right? It tells you something about the kind of song this is, that even something like, you know, Jerusalem that we talked about last week, that has this image of this very sort of conservative, like England's green and pleasant land thing, can be reappropriated by the punk and the post-punk movement. And there were lots of sort of punk and post-punk recordings of that song. The Nightingale singing in Berkeley Square is just, you know, it's just not cool enough. There's not much you can do. It's so dripping with this kind of, I want to use the word sentimental here, but it's too sentimental for punk. But I want to use the word sentimental not in the pejorative sense, because I think the way that sentimentalism works, particularly in association with romantic and romantic period ideas, is that it's a really powerful appeal to your feelings, right? And it's not to the feelings of anger, it's to the feelings of sympathy and to resonating with one another in a sort of sense of community, which and I think that sense of the sentimental, the trying to generate senses of sympathy and sentiment in another person, I think, the punk movement was just allergic to that as an idea. There was much more about kind of, tearing things down rather than building things together. And again, I love punk, so I don't mean that in any pejorative sense either. But the punk is basically reactionary, and it's trying to undo things. This is trying to build connections in an interesting way.
I won't mention my appreciation or lack of it for punk, so we'll just move on from that. It does speak a little bit to the stability of this song that you left the groups with, this notion that this song remained much more stable than Jack Hall and the Jolly Young Waterman, which we looked at earlier. And why do you suppose that is? Is it that sentimentality? Is it, just stuck to the story?
Yeah, so I think that's part of it. I think it's really hard to imagine a version of this that is not sentimental, right? I mean, it's just so baked into the song that it's hard to imagine it breaking free of those bonds. I mean, the other thing that I would say about this is I think it tells you an awful lot about what the commercial recording industry does to music in the 20th century, right? Because all of these different versions are explicitly in reference to one another, right? People have heard a version of this song, they really like it, so they want to record their own version. And there's a certain circularity there that they all sort of share the same DNA in some way because they know it from previous recordings. That's not the case in something like Jack Hall or Sam Hall, and it's not the case in something like the Jolly Waterman, where it's known from the oral tradition, and the oral tradition thrives in variation. The more different variants there are, the more people are likely to want to sing it because it adapts to the local community. What is happening in the 20th century is a kind of the more loaded way of saying it is the sort of imperialism of culture, the kind of soft power thing, where certain ideas become absolutely dominant, right? And so it's much less about variation, change, needing to evolve to fit the moment, and much more about your ability to sing this song in the way that people are already familiar with, because people recognize and want that familiarity. So I think that the lack of variation in this song tells you an awful lot about what's happening to the music industry in the era of commercially recorded music. And everyone's receiving this from the same recordings, not from oral word of mouth.
It's interesting because one of our groups anticipated this matter in the way that you speak of it, and they wondered if the regulation in the industry in licensing and copyright might have prevented people from taking liberties. Well, that it might actually have been sort of legally compelling to stay with the strict.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really, really important point. And I would say that also has a long history, that copyright goes back to the 18th century. So Dibdin, who wrote the Jolly Waterman, for example, was always in court fighting battles because people kept pirating his stories, and particularly they were publishing them in broadsheet ballads, because and he was getting extremely upset about this because he got no money from it, right? And so a legal and bureaucratic system develops and the idea of a kind of intellectual property develops across the 18th century and into the 19th century. But then it really hits its stride when you get into the recording industry. And once you're able to sort of buy things, right? By people's voices. I mean, imagine that in the 18th century, the idea that you can buy someone's voice. It's such a strange idea to them. But so when they were thinking about sort of intellectual copyright ideas, they had something else entirely in mind. But once the commercial marketplace starts happening and people are buying records, physical objects, which contain a voice, that then changes the stakes of this idea of intellectual property. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the record companies in particular, they have very, very well-paid lawyers on their side to stop you from doing untoward things with their product, right? And that does really inhibit any kind of, development or variation in the song. You basically have to get permission from the artist, and more importantly, the studio with whom the artist is signed, before you can do anything with the song, and there are limits on that. I think by the time you get to the 21st century, things get pretty interesting with that, and partly because there's lots of file sharing going on, which is sort of extra legal, shall we say it politely, and people start changing and chopping, and especially sort of the mashup culture of the early 2000s, where people were taking recorded songs and then fusing them together in new and interesting ways. That does change a little bit about the solidity and stability of the song, but broadly speaking, you're still using the song that pre-existed, and that the recording companies have control over. So yeah,
it's clear that several of our groups had a conversation about that very thing, and about Jack Hall being passed along in sort of an oral tradition. You just remembered what you heard and then you picked it up, and it kind of evolved. Whereas the voices that you can buy, as you say, or the sheet music and things like that. It's interesting that
one thing that I just add to that, Father James, sorry to interrupt, is that a really important thing about the oral tradition is people's bad memories, right? And that's where a lot of the variation comes from. Is people forgot things and so made it up, right? And we often speak, particularly in sort of academic circles, about the importance of cultural memory, and this is the thing that we value. How does something get passed on from generation to generation? It's through cultural memory. But I want to say that cultural forgetting is just as important, because people just can't remember the words, and so they add their own thing, or they hear two different versions and have to figure out how to put them together. And so the importance of forgetting shouldn't be under amnesia is the key to the history of music.
Yes, indeed. Now this one is a curious one, given who wrote it and wrote the music and lyrics, because they had so many songs. But this one somehow remains the classic among them. Why do you suppose that is?
I have been struggling trying to come up with an answer to that exact question for a little while. Like, I think it's they did, and I sketched this a little bit in the video where I talk about Eric Maschwitz and Sherwin. They were extremely productive. They produced hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of songs. They weren't all alike. It would be an oversimplification to say that they were all similar, but they were all in the same sort of generic mode, which is kind of light entertainment for the West End theatres. That was where these guys really excelled, along with someone like Irving Berlin, who would be the other person that was very popular in the West End at the same time period. So why this song and not any of the literally hundreds of other songs that they between them wrote? I think some of that has to do with the recording technology, and I referred to this in one of my videos, that you end up with this odd snowball effect, right? That all you need is one popular recording, everybody hears that recording, and then they want to do their own version of it, and then it snowballs up from there. And the more different versions of it there are, the more people think that it's fair game for them to have a go, right? And so there is this sort of strange snowball effect. But why it is that it's this song that has that snowball effect and not one of the others, I think is a really interesting question. I think the Vera Lynn might have something to do with this, actually. And I think it's because the idea of the Nightingale singing in Berkeley Square, the Nightingale singing is a really powerful image, and often, female singers get called the Nightingale, right? And so there's this sort of strange meta quality to this song when Vera Lynn sings it, that she's singing about the Nightingale who sang in Berkeley Square, but she is herself the voice that sings beautifully to the troops and to the general populace. And I think that is the thing that possibly gave this song the edge, that sort of doubleness of the content being reflected in Vera Lynn's performance of it. And then because there was this sort of very extremely popular recording of it on I imagine it wasn't even vinyl at the time. I'm sure it was, wax cylinder or something. I don't know. I guess we're only talking about the Second World War. But yeah, because there were these famous recordings of it, then the snowball effects happened. So I think that doubleness of the Nightingale, both in the song and as the artist recording the song, makes it stand out a little bit above the others. But I would also say that probably 90% of it is just chance, and it could have been any one of the other ones. Like, I don't know that it's qualitatively better.
Our time together flies by all too quickly, Ian. And there are a number of questions outstanding, and I'm sorry about the group who've offered so many lovely questions, but I will give you one last one. Okay. How would you, and this is the curiosity about it having come from a short story of the same title, but how would you describe the relationship of the song to Arlen's short story? And do you think it matters that the song originated as a short story?
Okay, that's a great question. How to deal with that very quickly. So let me try and answer that by saying that I do think it matters that it started off as a short story, because partly because of the sort of circulation of the media, right? It appeared in a printed book. Here, I've got it right here. Here's the book that it was printed in. And so it was available to travel to the south of France, where Majoritz then saw the title of the story and then absorbed it. So yeah, I think it matters that it had an existence in print before the short story. And I think, the thing that I would really want to draw attention to is just how resonant the title of the story is. And I think you need a humorist or a satirist like Arlen to come up with that line, right? It's a really appealing line, the Nightingale that swings in Berkeley Square. It has an instant appeal. And I think, you need the rest of the context of the story in order to be able to come up with that sort of great line about this sort of rural birds singing in urban London, right? So yeah, I think it does matter that it started off as a story.
Well, thank you, Ian. Thanks a lot. We're really grateful for your guiding us through these last 4 sessions, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. The whole thing has me wanting to take Ian's classes, or maybe, insisting he give me an extended tour of London, because he seems to know all the ins and outs. As we conclude, I want to reiterate my thanks to our sponsors. We'd like to especially thank Mary Scott and her team at the Notre Dame Alumni Association. And finally, thanks to our London Global Gateway Communications team, who has done all of the backroom work bringing the London Book Club together. I want to thank Amelia Stawicki, Bridget Keating, Tom Finch, and Joe Byrne. I want to give a particular shout out to Joe Byrne as she takes her leave of us next week for a new position elsewhere. She has been a great contributor to all our efforts in the London Global Gateway, and we will miss her greatly. We send her off with our affection and God's blessings, and hope to God we can live up to the good work that she has done in the past. As we sign off, we invite those of you who wish to enter into the community circles that we've created around these events, and for further conversation with anyone, with all who choose to remain. So thanks so much, and God bless. We'll keep you informed about other London book clubs in the future.